The burning of Washington stands as one of the most dramatic and humiliating moments in early American history. Also known as the capture of Washington, this event marked the only time since the American Revolutionary War that a foreign power successfully captured and occupied the capital of the United States. In the summer of 1814, during the War of 1812, British forces launched a bold amphibious campaign along the Chesapeake Bay. The operation was overseen by Rear Admiral George Cockburn as part of Admiral John Warren's broader Chesapeake strategy. Their objective was clear: strike directly at the political heart of the young American Republic. On August 24, 1814, American defenses collapsed at the Battle of Bladensburg, just outside Washington, D.C. Poor coordination, inexperienced militia, and overwhelming British discipline led to a swift American defeat. With the road to the capital left unguarded, British troops under the command of Major General Robert Ross marched into Washington that very evening. What followed shocked the nation. British soldiers and sailors systematically set fire to major public buildings, including the United States Capitol, the Presidential Mansion, later known as the White House, and the Washington Navy Yard. Government offices, military installations, and symbols of American sovereignty were engulfed in flames. The image of Washington burning sent waves of fear and outrage throughout the country and remains one of the most iconic scenes of the War of 1812. The burning of Washington was not an unprovoked act. British leaders viewed the attack as retaliation for earlier American actions in Upper Canada. In 1813, U.S. forces had burned and looted the town of York, present-day Toronto, and later destroyed much of Port Dover. The destruction of Washington was intended as a direct response, and a powerful warning. Nature soon intervened. Less than 4 days after the fires began, a violent thunderstorm swept through the city. Some historians believe it may have been a hurricane, accompanied by a tornado. The storm extinguished many of the fires but also caused additional destruction, toppling buildings and killing both civilians and soldiers. The British occupation of Washington, D.C., ultimately lasted only about 26 hours. As the capital burned, President James Madison and his administration were forced to flee. Madison spent the night in Brookville, a small town in Montgomery County, Maryland, which briefly became the effective capital of the United States. He took shelter in the home of Caleb Bentley, a Quaker farmer. That house, now known as the Madison House, still stands today as a quiet reminder of one of America's darkest hours. The burning of Washington did not end the war, but it left a lasting scar on the American psyche. It exposed the vulnerabilities of the nation, tested its resilience, and ultimately strengthened its resolve. From the ashes of the Capitol emerged a renewed determination to defend American independence, no matter the cost. When the United States declared war on Britain in 1812, the conflict unfolded against a much larger global struggle. The United Kingdom was already deeply engaged in a life-or-death war against Napoleonic France. That war consumed most of Britain's military strength, strategic focus, and financial resources, leaving little room for a full-scale conflict in North America. As a result, Britain's early strategy in the War of 1812 was cautious. At sea, the Royal Navy imposed a powerful naval blockade on American ports, strangling trade and limiting U.S. naval movement. On land, British forces adopted a largely defensive posture. Reinforcing British troops in Canada was not feasible at the time, so the defense of British North America relied heavily on local militia units and indigenous allies supporting the regular British Army already stationed there. Everything changed in April 1814. Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated and exiled, freeing thousands of British troops and dozens of warships. With the European war temporarily settled, Britain could finally turn its full attention to the United States. The British government, led by Secretary of State for War and the Colonies the Earl of Bathurst, authorized a more aggressive campaign. An army brigade and additional naval forces were dispatched to Bermuda, Britain's key Atlantic stronghold. From there, the Royal Navy had already overseen the blockade of the American coastline and limited coastal occupations throughout the war. British planners now approved a new strategy: fast, destructive raids along the American Atlantic seaboard. These attacks were designed to draw American troops away from Canada, weaken morale, and demonstrate Britain's ability to strike deep into U.S. territory without committing to long-term occupation. Commanders were given strict instructions not to advance far inland or attempt to hold captured territory. These raids were meant to be swift, shocking, and politically damaging, not prolonged campaigns. In early 1814, Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy's North America and West Indies Station. From major naval bases in Bermuda and Halifax, he coordinated the blockade of American ports and planned expanded operations against the U.S. coastline, including attacks in Virginia and the Gulf Coast. Rear Admiral George Cockburn, who had already spent months raiding the Chesapeake Bay, played a critical role in shaping the campaign. By June 1814, Cockburn was convinced that American defenses in the region were dangerously weak. In letters to Cochrane, he warned that several major cities were vulnerable to attack and boldly predicted that, with sufficient force, the British could easily seize the American capital itself. Cochrane considered multiple targets, including Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and even Philadelphia. Cockburn strongly advocated for Washington. He believed the capital offered the greatest political impact and would send a powerful message far beyond its limited military value. Destroying the seat of American government, he argued, would humiliate the United States and weaken public confidence in the war. On July 18, 1814, Cochrane issued orders that left little room for doubt. British forces were instructed to deter the United States from repeating earlier actions by destroying towns and districts that could be attacked, while sparing the lives of unarmed civilians. The campaign was now explicitly punitive. Major General Robert Ross, chosen to command the land forces, was far less confident than Cockburn. He doubted that an army of fewer than 4,500 men, supported by Marines but lacking cavalry and heavy artillery, could march deep inland and capture an enemy capital. Ross rejected any plan to burn Washington entirely and later ensured that most privately owned property was spared. Retaliation was a major motivation behind the campaign. In 1813 and 1814, American forces had destroyed private property across Upper Canada, including the burning of York, the provincial capital, and the raid on Port Dover along Lake Erie. British officials viewed these actions as violations of the laws of war. In June 1814, Sir George Prevost, Governor-General of British North America, formally urged Cochrane to authorize retaliation that would discourage further American destruction. By August 1814, the stage was set. Ross commanded a well-trained force of British regulars and Royal Marines drawn from elite regiments of the British Army. This army would soon confront American forces at Bladensburg, opening the road to Washington, and setting the conditions for what would become known forever as the Burning of Washington. The Burning of Washington. In the aftermath of the American defeat at the Battle of Bladensburg, panic swept through Washington, D.C. President James Madison, members of his cabinet, and military officials abandoned the capital as British forces advanced unchecked. With no meaningful defenses remaining, the seat of the United States government was left exposed. That night, Madison and his administration fled north to Brookville, a small town in Montgomery County, Maryland. For one brief moment, Brookville became the functioning capital of the United States. Madison spent the night in the home of Caleb Bentley, a Quaker silversmith. The house, now known as the Madison House, still stands as a rare physical reminder of the crisis that engulfed the nation in August 1814. On the evening of August 24, 1814, British troops entered Washington. The invading force consisted of approximately 4,500 battle-hardened British regulars and Royal Marines, led by Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn. The plan to strike the capital had long been advocated by Cockburn, who believed Washington could be captured with ease and that its destruction would deliver a devastating political blow to the United States. Ross, more cautious by nature, had intended to limit damage to public buildings rather than destroy the city outright. Ross initially hoped for an orderly occupation. As British troops entered Washington under a flag of truce, however, shots were fired by American soldiers who had remained behind. Ross's horse was wounded, and 2 British soldiers were killed. According to historians, this unexpected resistance hardened Ross's resolve. Reluctantly, he authorized the burning of key government buildings, including the Capitol and the President's House. The first major target was the United States Capitol, then regarded by many visitors as the most impressive structure in the city. Beyond its architectural significance, it stood as the clearest symbol of American government and authority. British forces approached the building via Maryland Avenue and began their attack systematically, first setting fire to the south wing, which housed the House of Representatives, followed by the North Wing, home to the Senate. Before igniting the building, British troops looted its contents. At the time, the Capitol housed not only Congress but also the Library of Congress and the Supreme Court. Among the items taken was a U.S. Treasury ledger, later inscribed by Cockburn himself as a souvenir of the capture of Washington. Decades later, the book would be returned to the United States, a rare artifact linking the two former enemies. The fire spread rapidly. Wooden floors and ceilings fueled the flames, while glass skylights melted under the intense heat. The Library of Congress, containing some 3,000 volumes, was completely destroyed, along with irreplaceable architectural details designed by William Thornton and Benjamin Latrobe. Despite the devastation, parts of the Capitol survived. The rotunda, staircases, and several structural elements endured, preventing the building from being a total loss. The financial damage was immense, amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars at the time, equivalent to many millions today. The burning of the Capitol struck at the heart of American identity and sent shockwaves across the young nation. From the ruins of the Capitol, British forces marched along Pennsylvania Avenue toward the President's house. By then, President Madison had already fled. First Lady Dolly Madison remained behind briefly, racing against time to save valuable items from the approaching enemy. She organized enslaved workers and staff to remove important objects, including government silver and documents. Contrary to popular legend, Dolly Madison did not personally cut the famous portrait of George Washington from its frame. According to eyewitness Paul Jennings, an enslaved teenager who served as Madison's personal attendant, the portrait was removed by White House staff and sent away by wagon just moments before British troops arrived. Jennings later published his memoir, providing one of the earliest first-hand accounts of life inside the White House during the attack. When British troops entered the president's house, they found a formal dinner prepared, evidence that American leaders had expected to return. British officers and engineers sat down to the meal, eating the food and drinking the wine intended for the president and his guests. Only after finishing did they proceed with their orders. That night, British engineers deliberately set the president's house ablaze. Additional fuel was added to ensure the fire would continue burning into the following day. By morning, the building stood gutted and blackened, its white stone walls scarred by smoke and flame. The destruction would later give rise to the enduring name, White House, a reference to the whitewash applied to cover the burn marks during Reconstruction. The burning of Washington was swift, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. In less than 26 hours, the British struck at the very core of American political power, leaving behind ashes, humiliation, and a nation forced to confront its own vulnerability. The destruction of the White House did not mark the end of British actions in Washington. The following day, Rear Admiral George Cockburn continued moving through the Capitol, targeting additional symbols of American political life. One of his intended targets was the office of the National Intelligencer, a prominent Washington newspaper that had repeatedly criticized Cockburn by name, portraying him as a ruthless aggressor. Cockburn arrived at the building fully prepared to burn it to the ground. However, several local women confronted him, pleading that a fire would spread to their neighboring homes. Relenting only partially, Cockburn abandoned the plan to burn the structure. Instead, he ordered his troops to dismantle the building brick by brick. In a final act of personal retaliation, he reportedly ordered all printing type bearing the letter C destroyed, declaring that the journalists would no longer have the means to abuse his name. British troops also searched for wealth within the United States Treasury, hoping to seize money or valuables. They found only old financial records. Disappointed but undeterred, they set the Treasury ablaze along with several other public buildings. The War Department building was also burned, though most of its records had already been removed, limiting the long-term damage. Only a small number of older documents were lost. One federal building was spared entirely. The first U.S. Patent Office survived due to the determined efforts of William Thornton, the original architect of the Capitol and then Superintendent of Patents. Thornton personally appealed to British officers, arguing that the building housed inventions and knowledge belonging to all humanity, not just the United States. His appeal succeeded. When the smoke cleared, the Patent Office stood as the only major government building left untouched in Washington. Elsewhere, much of the destruction had already been carried out by American hands. Anticipating capture, U.S. forces had set fire to the Washington Navy Yard on orders dating back to Thomas Jefferson's presidency. The goal was to prevent weapons, supplies, and ships from falling into British control. Among the losses were 2 nearly completed warships. Only a few structures within the Navy Yard survived, including the Latrobe Gate and several officers' quarters. The Marine barracks and the Commandant's house were also spared, though nearby private property suffered damage. On the afternoon of August 25, British troops were dispatched to secure a fort at Greenleaf's Point, later known as Fort McNair. Although the Americans had already destroyed the fort, large quantities of gunpowder remained. While British soldiers attempted to dispose of the barrels, the powder detonated in a massive explosion. Dozens of British troops were killed or wounded in an instant, one of the deadliest single incidents of the entire Washington campaign. The storm that saved Washington. Less than 4 days after the burning of Washington began, the city was struck by a sudden and violent storm. Torrential rain poured down, extinguishing many of the fires that still smoldered across the capital. Some contemporary accounts describe the storm as a hurricane, and it may have produced a tornado that tore through the heart of the city, lifting cannons from the ground and hurling them through the air. Both British soldiers and American civilians were killed in the chaos. The storm has entered American legend as the storm that saved Washington. According to popular belief, it forced the British to abandon the city. In reality, historians note that British commanders never intended to occupy Washington for long. Their objective had always been destruction, not conquest. Once the government buildings were ruined, the mission was complete. Even so, the storm worsened the devastation. Rain cracked heated stone walls, collapsed weakened structures, and damaged buildings the British had not intended to destroy, including parts of the city that had survived the fires. Rather than rescuing Washington, the storm intensified the city's suffering. A famous exchange is said to have occurred between Cockburn and a Washington resident during the storm. When the woman declared the violent weather a divine intervention meant to drive the British away, Cockburn reportedly replied that it was doing precisely the opposite, assisting Britain in the destruction of the city, before riding off. Within hours, British forces withdrew to their ships, many of which had been damaged by the storm. The occupation of Washington had lasted barely 26 hours. In that short time, the United States Capitol, the President's House, the Treasury, the War Department, the Navy Yard, and multiple other government sites had been destroyed or crippled. British casualties during the campaign were relatively light, though not insignificant. The material damage inflicted on Washington was enormous, amounting to hundreds of thousands of pounds at the time, equivalent to millions today. As British troops departed the capital, another force captured Alexandria, Virginia, across the Potomac River. Unlike Washington, Alexandria was spared after its leaders agreed to surrender supplies peacefully. The burning of Washington ended almost as suddenly as it began, yet its impact endured. The attack exposed the fragility of the young republic, shocked the American public, and reshaped national priorities. From the ashes of its capital, the United States would rebuild, not just its buildings, but its determination to survive in a world still dominated by empires. In the days following the burning of Washington, the American government began the slow process of returning to a shattered capital. President James Madison and senior military officers re-entered Washington by September 1, 1814. That same day, Madison issued a proclamation urging citizens to defend the District of Columbia, signaling that the nation would not abandon its capital despite the devastation. Congress remained absent for several weeks. When lawmakers finally reconvened on September 19, they met in an improvised location, the Post and Patent Office building housed inside Blodgett's Hotel. It was one of the few structures in Washington large enough to accommodate the full Congress and had survived the fires. Congress would continue meeting there until late 1815, when construction of the temporary old brick Capitol was completed. Public reaction in the United States was swift and emotional. Many Americans, including newspapers aligned with the anti-war Federalist Party, condemned the burning of Washington's public buildings as unnecessary vandalism. Even critics of the Madison administration viewed the destruction of the Capitol and the President's House as an attack on national dignity rather than a legitimate military act. Reaction in Britain was deeply divided. A significant portion of the British public expressed shock and discomfort at the destruction of Washington. Across continental Europe, where capitals had frequently been occupied during the Napoleonic Wars, It was widely accepted that occupying forces spared public buildings from destruction. The burning of Washington stood in contrast to this tradition. British publications and political leaders warned that the attack had damaged Britain's moral standing. Some members of Parliament openly criticized the government, arguing that the destruction of a few buildings in a poorly defended capital was being exaggerated as if it were the capture of a major European city. At the same time, many in Britain strongly defended the attack. They viewed the War of 1812 as a conflict initiated by the United States and saw the burning of Washington as justified retaliation. British commentators repeatedly cited American actions in Canada, particularly the burning of York in Upper Canada in 1813, as precedent. From this perspective, Washington's fate was a direct consequence of American decisions. British officials echoed this sentiment. Sir George Prevost described the destruction of Washington as just retribution, while the Reverend John Strawn, who had personally witnessed American destruction in Canada, argued that the damage inflicted on the U.S. capital was mild compared to what American forces had done to Canadian towns and private property. When British forces finally withdrew, they carried with them symbolic trophies of the campaign. Among these were portraits of King George III and Queen Charlotte discovered in American public buildings. These portraits remain on display in Bermuda today, quiet reminders of the war's global reach and the brief moment when the British flag flew over Washington. The burning of Washington did not decide the War of 1812, but it reshaped how Americans viewed their nation's security, leadership, and identity. Out of humiliation came resolve. The capital would be rebuilt. The institutions it represented would endure. And the memory of August 1814 would become a lasting warning about the cost of unpreparedness and the resilience required to survive it. If you found this deep dive into the burning of Washington insightful, make sure to like the video to support the channel. Subscribe to History Love for more in-depth documentaries that bring forgotten moments of history back to life. Share your thoughts in the comments. Was the burning of Washington justified retaliation, or an unnecessary act of destruction?